What's going on, guys? TowerNumberNine here, and today we are going to continue the Force 5 series, where I'm playing at least 5 games with every leader from Jump to Lightspeed. Today, we have a leader that I have played many more than 5 times, Wedge Antilles, and I ended up coming up with a Cunning deck for Wedge after trying a bunch of different options. I think this deck is pretty cool, and I think it's actually, I think it has the potential to be pretty strong as well. So let's get into it. Wedge Antilles, leader of Red Squadron. This is a character that I really like. He was in a bunch of the movies, and he was also in a bunch of old novels. There were these X-Wing novels back in the old days. They called it the Expanded Universe then. It's Legends now. Not canonical anymore to modern Star Wars or whatever, but I enjoyed them when I was a kid. So I have a bit of a soft spot for Wedge, and he was one of the leaders I was most excited to play with in Jump to Lightspeed. So on his leader side, Wedge is a command heroism leader. As an action, you can exhaust to play a card from your hand using piloting, and it costs 1 less. When he deploys on 5 or more resources, he can either be a 3/6 vanilla on the ground or a leader upgrade that grants +3/+4, makes the attached unit a leader unit, and it gains on attack. The next pilot card you play this phase costs 1 less. So when he is deployed as a pilot upgrade, you get to discount not just a pilot card played with piloting, but you can also discount the pilot card if you play it normally. So on his leader side, you only get the discount if you actually use the piloting ability and play the card as an upgrade, while when he is deployed as a pilot himself, his on-attack ability can discount a pilot even if you play it as a ground unit. Both of these deploys are a little weak stat-wise, but his leader side is so strong that it can really make up for it. I think probably Wedge should have had +4 power as a pilot leader, but it's not. This deck isn't really focused on being a high impact leader deployment style deck. We're not relying on Wedge to do a ton of damage personally. Often it's best for him to just deploy on the ground and start swinging for 3, but his discount can be really, really strong. And that's one of the things that's most relevant here. You're going to want to try to use that discount frequently if possible, and there are a lot of good pilots to choose from in this build to help maximize that discount. The overall game plan is to attack very aggressively. It's an aggro deck. You want to end the game fast. You want to be attacking your opponent's base most of the time, not focusing on their units. You use those pilots to buff the space units that you play, and just push damage as quickly as possible. So by default, the plan is going to be to play small ships, upgrade them with pilots, and attack in the space arena. But if you see a lot of trouble in space, maybe your opponent has some strong units there, maybe you know that your opponent has cards like shoot down and so on, you can use an alternate plan where instead you play your pilots to the ground arena in order to threaten the opponent there and catch them off guard. This can also be worthwhile to deploy pilots to the ground if there's a lot of upgrade removal present. Because maybe your opponent has a bunch of upgrade removal cards in their deck and you don't want to risk that. If you go against traditional removal like you would see in a control deck, one of those villain decks where they have a bunch of Power of the Dark Side merciless contest, you're going to want to try to defeat that by using multiple small units, which this deck is also really well suited for because the pilots can be played as units as well as upgrades, and many of them are quite cheap. And then you're going to want to use damage pumps to close the game fast, cards like Surprise Strike, Pilot Han, and so on. So that's the overall game plan. When playing this deck, you typically want to be the aggro. If you are in a matchup against another aggro deck, you typically want to try and race them. And there are several exhaust cards. There are a few in the main deck and then several more in the sideboard that you can bring in to try and slow down another aggro deck and win that race. So the main advantage of this deck is that you have these pilots that are already very efficient, and Wedge makes them even more efficient. So normally in Star Wars Unlimited, an upgrade would be, on curve if we had something like an X cost upgrade that gives +X+X. So a 2 cost upgrade that gives +2/+2 is a pretty reasonable card. And there is a card just like that, Academy Training, that actually did see play at least at one time. Not too common these days. And similarly, you see cards like General's Blade, 3 for +3/+3, and quite a few different 1 cost +1/+1 plus a little upside upgrades as well. The pilots are even better than that. So if we look at these pilots here, we have Nia Num, 1 for +1/+2 instead of +1/+1. Andy has good text. Han Solo has his moments, 2 for +2/+3 and very good text. Chewie is 3 for +3/+3 and has crazy good text, at least against control. So you're often getting stats that are actually better than that X cost plus X, and you're getting good text, and you have that additional upside of being able to play your pilot as a ground unit if need be. Now, the downside to all this is that pilots are less flexible than normal upgrades. They have to be played specifically on vehicle units, and you normally cannot play a pilot on a vehicle that already has a pilot. Some exceptions do apply. So that's the usual trade-off, and for Wedge, that trade-off becomes even better on the piloting side, because with the discount of 1, these become not just good deals but crazy good deals. So that's what this deck is looking to maximize. Now, the disadvantage is that if you're playing a bunch of cheap ships and you're playing a bunch of pilots and discounting them, you're potentially playing multiple cards in a turn, and you may be running out of cards. So we have some cards incorporated to mitigate this. So Boshek, Charismatic Smuggler, you can play him either as a ground unit who's a 3-cost 3/4, or for 2, 1 with Wedge's ability. You can play him as an upgrade on a friendly vehicle without a pilot, and if you play him as an upgrade, you discard 2 cards from your deck and return each of those cards with an odd cost to your hand, which is going to potentially allow you to draw 2 cards. This deck has significantly more odd costed cards than it has even costed cards. So Boshek should draw you somewhat more than 1 card on average, which should be a good way to get some card advantage and make up for the downside of piloting. We also have the Mining Guild TIE Fighter. So this ability can be expensive to use. On attack, you may pay 2 to draw a card, but it can also be worthwhile, and it helps you implement those MSU, multiple small unit tactics, by being a cheap card to play in those scenarios where you're worried about 1-for-1 removal. Now, the Mining Guild TIE Fighter does have quite bad stats, but you can fix that via pilots, which this deck is already built around. So we have some ways to mitigate the downside, the downside of going through cards quickly. Now, 1-cost ships are quite important to that deck. We already took a look at the Mining Guild TIE Fighter. The Cartel Turncoat's another classic. Having 1-cost ships can be important for using piloting well. They're cheap. They enable important pilot plays, and there's a lot of times where with Wedge's discount, you can do a cool play that is enabled by having a 1-cost ship. So, for instance, you can play this Cartel Turncoat on turn 1, and then because you have that discount, you can also play Boshek. He would normally cost 2. With Wedge, he only costs 1. Now you have a 3/5 on turn 1, and you potentially drew up to 2 cards as well. Pretty sweet play. Similarly, you can play, there are 2 3-cost pilots in this deck that are really good. Luke Skywalker, You Still With Me, and the pilot Chewie. Both of those, let's say you play a vehicle turn 1, turn 2, you play one of those pilots with Wedge's discount, still have a resource left. There's a 1, and then you play a 1-cost ship. So this is maybe one of the main reason that this deck is using Cunning, because of the access to good 1-cost ships. They add substantial flexibility and upside. They enable the multiple small units tactics, and they're also quite good against Quinlan, who is reliant on playing things that cost the same as your opponent's card and often tends to play on curve as a result. So 1-cost ships, really good for Wedge. Let's take a look at the build. So as you can see here, we have quite a few 1-cost units. There's 7 1-cost ships, 3 Cartel Turncoats, 3 Mining Guild Ties, 1 Republic Y-Wing. We also have 4 1-cost pilots, 2 copies of Nia Num, and 2 R2-D2s. We have 6 2-cost ships to give us some more ships to potentially play on the first turn, 3 copies of Luke Skywalker, You Still With Me. We have 2 copies of Bamboozle to potentially slow down other aggressive decks, knock counters off Lieutenant Childson, that sort of thing. Breaking In as a pump that allows us to get past Sentinels. Surprise Strike, just a classic card. We've got Blue Leader, which is a good ambush play, helps you contest the space arena against decks that are fighting there. Can also be played for 5 to ambush on the ground, which can definitely give some people a surprise. Boshek, who we discussed earlier. Leia Organa, pilots to your stations. So she buffs pilots, or piloted units. And normally one might play Fleet Lieutenant in this type of role. Fleet Lieutenant gives a bigger attack buff, but Leia has better stats after being played. She gives Restore, which is similar to Fleet Lieutenant's value overall if you're in an aggro race. And because several of the units that we're playing this deck are not rebels, Leia is, I think, overall a better pick for the build. We have 3 copies of the classic Millennium Falcon piece of junk, 2 copies of the new Millennium Falcon Get Out and Push from Jump to Lightspeed, 2 copies of Pilot Poe, 2 copies of Red Leader, 2 copies of Pilot Chewie, and 3 copies of Pilot Han. So as you can see here, this deck has a very low to the ground cost curve. We have a bunch of 1-cost cards, and our most expensive cards are 5 costs, and honestly, most of the time we're playing those 5-cost units as pilots for significantly cheaper, not actually playing them for 5. So it's a very aggressive deck with cheap cards. In the sideboard, we have 2 copies of Confiscate. This is largely here as a counter to Traitorous. I think Traitorous is not a card that should be in your deck at this point in the game. I think it's extremely vulnerable to upgrade removal, and there's a bunch of upgrade removal around as a potential answer to pilots. So I think it's super risky to play Traitorous, but I have seen some people playing it. Confiscate punishes that. Also useful against boss decks to take out their bounties. Also useful against other decks that are going to be using pilots against you. Electromagnetic Pulse is in there as an exhaust and damage against vehicles. This can help you take over the space arena against another space-focused deck, and can also be a trick to slow down other aggro decks and help you win the race. Bamboozle there, similar sort of thing, kind of some upgrade removal, also a potential way to slow down aggro. Breaking In, good against decks that have a bunch of Sentinels. Another copy of Pilot Chewie to play against Control, and 2 copies of Timely Reinforcements, which can be a good later game card, as well as something to bring in if you are against a deck where Bamboozle doesn't matter very much. So that's the deck, that's the sideboard. We are on the 30 HP yellow base here, and let's take a look at a few more specific interactions. So we have several buffs in this build to offer bonus damage when needed. 2 copies of Breaking In. Attack with a unit, it gets +2 power and gains Saboteur for this attack. Han Solo has his moments. Similarly, acts as a attack pump buff card when you play him via piloting. I play him via piloting a large majority of the time. It is rare for me to ambush him in this build. You can do it. Sometimes it's the right play, but usually you should be thinking of this as a piloting upgrade. Surprise Strike, 2 cost. Attack with a unit, gets +3 power for this attack. Classic card. Came out in Spark of Rebellion. It's been good ever since. It's still good. Great card to have here to try and close the game. We also have a single copy of Hotshot Deal 44 Blaster, which is something to probably put in your resource row and maybe smuggle out onto the ground, because believe it or not, Wedge should usually go ground. I've normally found sending Wedge to the ground to be a better idea. If you look at his stats, putting Wedge on the ground gives you 3, 6, 9 points of stats. Putting him in space gives you 3, 4, 7 points of stats. So you're just getting more stats to play Wedge on the ground. The ability usually doesn't matter that much by the time that you're deploying Wedge, and it's comparatively rare for me to actually put Wedge in space. Also, playing him on the ground allows you to get around upgrade removal, bamboozle, all kinds of stuff like that. It's a little unfortunate thematically. I do think that ideally Wedge would have had a 4th point of power when played as an upgrade, which would make that a lot more enticing for an aggressive deck like this. But as it stands, most of the time you're going to want to send Wedge to the ground arena. But there are 2 relevant exceptions. So one of them is with Red Leader form up. If you attach a pilot to this unit, you create an X-Wing token. If you don't have another pilot to attach to it, I was just discussing how Wedge has 9 points of stats when played as a when played to the ground arena, and 7 when played as a pilot. But if playing him on Red Leader is going to give you that X-Wing token, then you're getting an additional 4 points of stats, making it more worthwhile for you to play him as a pilot. You could also see some scenario where the opponent has locked down space and you have to go ground, or you have to go ground to avoid a space sentinel, or perhaps more commonly where the opponent has put a sentinel on the ground and you want to send Wedge out as a pilot to avoid their ground sentinel. But then the other unit that synergizes is Millennium Falcon Get Out and Push, which gets an additional +1 power for each pilot on it and can have additional pilots on it. Putting Wedge on the Falcon here does give you that 4th point of power. You do get a little bit less overall stats, but it's probably worth it in order to push more damage to base if there isn't upgrade removal heading in. And you can often tell either by seeing your opponent's deck list or just having a feel for what they're playing, whether or not they have upgrade removal. Bamboozle is the most dangerous card in this area because it can be played for 0. So I would definitely err on the side of deploying to ground if you are playing against Cunning heroism decks. But overall, I think that there are some cases where you're going to deploy Wedge in space. Ground is usually the safer plan. Here are some cards that didn't make the cut, but I think might be worth considering. So the X-34 Landspeeder is a 2-cost 2/3 with Ambush, and it is also a ground vehicle. So I think this is an interesting card because it allows you to potentially start making pilot plays on the ground, which I think many people don't necessarily anticipate. The main thing that gives me pause about this is just that I like going space if possible, and I don't have anything that like interacts really well with the Ambush. Like, if you play this in a Quinlan deck, you can use Quinlan's Ping to remove the shield from a 2/2 shielded, and then Ambush to defeat it with the Landspeeder, which is really high value. Wedge doesn't have any direct synergy like that seems super cool, though the ability to potentially pilot it can be relevant. Commence Patrol is a 1-cost event. Put another card in a discard pile on the bottom of its owner's deck, and if you do create an X-Wing token, I think this is a really good card. Not because it does this weird thing about moving stuff into the discard pile, but because it is a 1-cost X-Wing. So that's another, option for multiple small units. Get another thing on the field. I would probably rather have a 1-cost X-Wing token, which is a 2/2, rather than the Republic Y-Wing, which is a 1-cost 1/3. However, because this requires you to put a card in a discard pile on the bottom of the owner's deck, and you don't know how early that's going to happen, and it probably won't happen on turn 1. This can't be played on turn 1 a lot of the time when those sorts of things are most useful, which is why it didn't make the cut. And then Commandeer, take control of a non-leader vehicle unit that costs 6 or less without a pilot on it. If you do ready it at the start of that next upgrade phase, next regroup phase, return that unit to its owner's hand. Commandeer is a card that a lot of people were running as a tech card against Jango Fett recently. Now Jango's suspended, so you don't have to worry about that. But Commandeer is still quite relevant against certain Space Sentinels or units with Restore in space. It didn't make the cut right here. It is expensive, and it's a relatively situational card, but it's really good in that situation. So if you start seeing a lot of people running cards that can be countered by Commandeer against you, it may be a relevant thing to include. There's one more card I really want to highlight, which is kind of a special case. Should this deck be playing Petranaki Arena? So Petranaki Arena, in theory, should be stronger than a 30 HP base for this, I think. It's a 26 HP base that gives each leader unit you control +1 power. It's worth noting that if Wedge deploys as a pilot, he makes the unit that he's piloting a leader unit. So this essentially would buff Wedge and allow you to mitigate his kind of weak stats. It would likely add some extra damage. That's good against control. When you're the aggro against control, your base HP generally doesn't matter. It's all about whether their base HP is going to be depleted before they stabilize. So losing 4 of your own base HP in exchange for doing some more damage with your leader swings. If you say, okay, I'll probably get to swing with Wedge like 2 times per game on average, that means that I am losing 4 HP on my base to remove 2 HP from my opponent's base. That is actually quite worth it if you are the aggro against control, but the meta has been really fast recently. And I want to say as a caveat, there have been a bunch of recent suspensions that could change things. So DJ being removed is going to make control decks more viable. Jango being removed, Jango was very fast. And Triple Dark Raid was also a very fast card for various villain builds. So with all those changes seem to point towards more control perhaps entering the meta, and it's possible that it will be correct to switch onto the Petranaki Arena at that time. But at least for now, I'm going to be perhaps more conservative and stay on that 30 HP base for those aggro mirrors. But we'll have to see what exactly happens, and I could easily see a world where the Petranaki Arena is going to be better in the future. So that's really the overview of the build. And again, you want to play this as a very aggro deck, but there are some other options for running Wedge. So the main one that seemed interesting in my testing was Wedge Red. So for a cause I believe in, and K2SO give you a lot of reach after the opponent potentially stabilizes. Cassian Andor is a great smuggle option. You can use that to mitigate some of the card draw issues where you might be running low on cards. And I also found that an aggression Wedge build could lean more heavily on rebel synergies because more of the cards that you're playing there are rebels. But the options there for 1-cost chips are much worse. All you have is the Crackshot V-Wing, which isn't that good a card. It is not as explosive as Cunning. You don't have the Millennium Falcon. You don't have Surprise Strike. And it is not as good at drawing cards. There are some things you can do. So I thought that like Stay on Target was a cool card that allows you to pump, attack the opponent's base, and potentially draw a card to replace it. But overall, I ended up liking the Cunning version more. I do think there is an aggression Wedge deck that isn't crazy. You can run Rebel Assault and stuff to give you some more explosive power. And there are definitely some good cards available in aggression heroism, but ultimately I liked the Cunning version of the deck more. So Yeah, those are my thoughts on Wedge. I think relative to the average one of these Force 5 decks, this one is a lot stronger, to be honest. I think this could be a valid aggro deck, competitively speaking. Although I don't, I have not tested it in super high, intense competitive testing. But I'm curious to know what you think. Do you think, oh, you're crazy? This deck's terrible. Do you think, oh, I've been playing this and I think you missed a card that I think is good? Is there some other feedback that you have for this, some other color pairing that you think might be good? I'd be curious to hear in the comments below. Also, feel free to tell me what leader you want to see next in these videos. There are going to be more of these Force 5 videos. I'm not entirely sure which leader I'll cover next, so let me know who you want to see next in the comments. And if you like this video, please feel free to leave a like. And if you didn't like this video, please feel free to leave a dislike. I know it's kind of weird for a YouTuber to ask someone to dislike a video if they didn't like it, but I genuinely look at the like-dislike ratio to see how popular certain content is. It does help me plan out what to do next. We'll have more Star Wars Unlimited content on the way soon. If you want to see more, go ahead and subscribe. And yeah, Tower number 9 signing off. I'll catch you guys later.